All right, today I will be talking about The Moravian Nights by Peter Handke. Handke, I'm guessing is how you pronounce it. And available to us to enjoy in English by Krishna Winston. The reason that I picked up this particular book goes back to the first time that I was kind of interested in following who won the Nobel, which is something that I don't really care about anymore, was in 2019, and it went to Peter Handke. And this particular book was the most recent book that he'd written at the time. And so in that sense, it kind of stuck with me in my memory as something I always wanted to check out. So eventually I did end up getting not only this book, but two other books, Repetition and I think like The Journey Home or something like that. And I started reading one of them. I can't remember which, but I ended up just really disliking it. I did not gel with it at all. So these books all went into the donate pile, but in particular, The Moravian Night, I wanted to read as it stuck out in my memory from that time, now half a decade ago, and I decided to finally just sit down and give it a try. And I have to be honest, I almost didn't continue it because the first chapter is very difficult. It's very rough getting into things. It's not a novel on the front, it's a story. And that's kind of, I think, very central to this book, because this book, it almost reminds me of postmodernist fiction in the way that it is not simply telling a story, but it is also a story about telling stories. And it's a story where the story being told is being told by an unreliable narrator, being narrated in the first person by whom is entirely unclear and seems to shift as the novel goes on. And what you take literally and what you don't take literally, a lot of it is very symbolic, obviously. And it leads to something that, again, is not just a narrative, but a sort of meta-narrative on the commentary of stories and the way that we tell stories, which, as I talked about in my Aunt Kind review, I'm not a huge fan of postmodernist literature, because I find the deconstruction of literature and the way that we tell stories often ends to an exercise in wit, which very often is for its own sake and forgets the human element of the story. It's commenting on how we tell stories, or the way stories are told or whatnot, but rather than doing so in a sense that reveals something about humanity, is really something, just revealing something about the nature of storytelling. And even then, in my experience, often tends to just be a very surface level observation at that. So I'm not really a huge fan of this type of story, but nonetheless, what kept me reading, beyond just the fact that once you get past that first chapter, it gets easier to follow and keep track of, is that Handke's prose can be extremely evocative. And I think that is where the core of it lies. So moving into the summary of the story, without getting, like, at its most simple, at the core storytelling level, it is about a former writer who gathers together a group of friends on his boat to tell a story through the night of his journey across Europe. And then you have the sort of meta-narrative, which is weaving in and out of this, which is him telling the story and how he's telling the story and how they're taking the story, how they interject in the story, how they contradict the story. And there's also a level where you're being described the story. It is not the story in literally the writer's own words, as is evidenced by various points where he talks, such as this particular paragraph. But why was he looking to explain the reappearance of the village in dreams, he of all people who normally shied away from any kind of explanation and responded to anyone who began offering explanations with a blank, if not withering gaze? Since when did he need explanations? Since when had he stopped writing? since he no longer wrote sentences, one after the other, linked by because, as a result of, and due to. Wasn't this precisely an attempt on our part to come up with such explanations? Since when did we, his listeners, his friends, more or less, need explanations? Since when did we cease to be his readers? Isn't that precisely? Enough about explanations. Now and forever, amen. So, it's this mix of, you're being told the story that God, I just have to think about this. Like, you're being told the story that is the story of him telling his story, which is why the subheader, a story, is a much more accurate assessment of it than a novel. And I think a very suitable subtitle, a very suitable classification. Let's go with that. So, to whom would I recommend this book? I don't know, and it's difficult for me to say, because a lot of this book, I think, is very much an examination on an individual's European identity, particularly in Central Europe. The Balkans is a huge thrust of this story, as well as Europe post-World War II. And really the shift in the borders, the shift in identity, the shift in cultures, and everything that kind of changed around that. There's a lot of symbolism there, and a lot of experiences that, as an American, I find very interesting, but very difficult to follow and appreciate. And it's very much written from the perspective of somebody who already has that kind of knowledge, or that kind of pre-assumption. This is a book written for Europeaners, and as an American, it makes it... There's a lot of sort of prerequisites and pre-assumptions to understanding the characters and the situations that I lack. But at the same time, I think that the language is really interesting and can be really captivating. And I think that I gained something from reading it. And I think that some of the examinations on storytelling and why we tell stories are interesting. So this is very much going to be a story that I would recommend to people who sort of enjoy the kind of postmodern playing with form, playing with structure in order to reveal something about form and structure, or somebody with a stronger grounding in European history who would probably appreciate that side more, or somebody who really just appreciates kind of beautiful prose, but with the caveat that this is not a book that I would recommend to anybody who really cares about characters. And like I said, it tends to be more about place and identity relative to place, but that doesn't necessarily make it what I'm increasingly thinking of as like a psychological novel, in the sense that it's not really a question of exploring a character's psyche so much as it is exploring, like I said, a sense of place and identity relative to the shifting social situations and times, vis-a-vis a bunch of more shorter, contained adventures. So if that sounds intriguing to you, check it out. But at the same time, I can see why it's not exactly going to be for everyone, why a lot of people might struggle with it, and why, honestly, while I enjoyed it, and while it did convince me to rescue Peter Handke from the donate pile, because I do want to give his other books a read, and I want to eventually someday give this book a reread, I did nonetheless find it a very difficult read, but not difficult in the same sense that Hard Like Water was difficult, where Hard Like Water was difficult because the main character was such an unpleasant person to be in their head for an extended period of time. This book was difficult because of the sort of utter lack of characters, the way in which the language was very poetic, but at the same time, like I said, not very psychological, very beautiful, very evocative, very good at capturing, and this kind of goes into the prose. The language is like the single biggest pro of the book, because it is so evocative and so good at painting a scene in powerful images, which, curiously, some of the observations in the book I would also consider a pro. And one of the sort of observations of the book is when it comes to memory, when it comes to the things that stick out to us when we're reflecting in our past, that they tend to be the sort of smaller things, the smaller moments. They're not necessarily the bigger moments that we can define or that we expect to be the things that stick out in our memory. They're almost assuredly going to be the smaller, almost impromptu seconds or flashes of not really inspiration, but basically that same concept. And in a lot of ways, that's what the prose was for me, where it wasn't necessarily that I found the whole thing beautiful. In fact, I found the whole thing actually incredibly difficult. I don't want to say boring, but it didn't catch me. It didn't grab me because I wasn't invested in a character, and because I didn't understand the history and symbology enough to really connect with it on that level. It left me sort of really high and dry on anything to connect to, and consequently, a lot of these long paragraphs, I would actually find myself just like halfway through a page and then realize that I am not thinking about anything on the page. In fact, it's a book where if there was anything else on my mind that flashed through my head that I needed to do, I would need to get up and go do it, because it was never a book that I could become fully absorbed in, due in part just to the complete lack of connection with any of the characters in the book or any of the places. But that said, it nonetheless still had moments where the language was so evocative that it will stick forever in my mind. The sort of scene of these people gathered on the boat, talking about this story, sharing the story through the night, this houseboat on the river. The scene in the Balkans where he's traveling by the bus and they go up to the hill and they have a ritual, and then the other people throwing rocks at the bus as they're crossing over the border. Just these various scenes and interactions, or the scene where he's walking with his fellow poet after the noise seminar, really are just kind of things that will stick in my memory. And a lot of that is just the way that they're written are so great that, how do you criticize something for not capturing your attention when at the same time some of the scenes that the prose can evoke and does evoke is so powerful and so lasting. And I really do think that he's an excellent writer and prose stylist. I just, again, all the things and the observations that the book makes about the nature of storytelling and whatnot, all the ways in which it puts layers between yourself and the narrative, really prevent me personally, this is just kind of how I read, from connecting with any human element. I need, for me, more of a human element in my books in order to feel like I connect with them. And while I do find, so, if it's a con, there is no human element to the story. So the pro is that the prose is really beautiful, but the con is that there's no human element, and that results in something that kind of made it really difficult to concentrate on the book, that the book failed to absorb me 80% of the time. Then another pro is that it does some interesting things nonetheless with what it's saying about narrative and the way that we tell stories, particularly in the character later on, Melchior, but also in this recognition of the way that we heighten stories and fictionalize certain things and heighten certain things in order to capture something almost more real than real. And the sort of recognition of that and those sort of parts of the story I very much enjoy. But again, it ties back to the con. It comes at the consequence of being something that makes it very hard for me to get into, like I said, and fully enmesh myself, because I need more than just rich prose and interesting ideas. I need characters. I need something, like I said, human to latch onto. So moving into themes, so kind of full spoilers as we get into this. This is where it gets really difficult for me, because the story is working on multiple different levels, and one of the big sub-levels is Europe. I already mentioned this sort of question of identity in Europe. And that definitely is one of the big themes as this character goes through various parts of Europe. And it's not just his interactions in this place as he questions his own identity, but it's how the people in these places are coping with the changes. So whether it's in Germany, where you have the East and the West, and then the wall came down, and he's kind of remembering his mother telling him stories about fleeing from East Germany to West Germany, and he's at this border town, and how the remnants of that sort of split are no longer there, and everything has changed and become integrated. Not necessarily one-to-one, but here in this border town, it's integrated. And the sort of his memory of the past is gone. Whether it's in his home land in Austria, where he's talking about the shifts there, whether it's in oh god, what is the name of the place? It starts with a K. God, look it up. I should have paused the video for this. Oh my god, I'm such a piece of shit. Oh god. Not the Balkans, god. Okay, it's not a place name, but they call it the meeting at Karst, and he's talking about this gathering, and it's the last gathering of a people who believe in a unified country. And specifically, again, the Balkans is a huge, it's where the book starts, it's where the book ends, it's where the writer presides. And it's the question of sort of trying to draw up borders post-World War II of territories and countries where territorial disputes and legacies go back generations and generations and generations. And it's kind of the same problem that you have in the Middle East, where sort of as Westerners, but there's this desire to draw up clean borders, but that's not going to happen because the territorial disputes age way back before that, and you have multiple people claiming cultural heritage over a place and are willing to go to war over it, and it doesn't matter how many borders the Western powers draw up, and it doesn't matter how many troops that they send to reinforce those borders. For the people there, their connection to the land is way deeper than any borders, and consequently, those conflicts will continue on regardless. And you see this in the Middle East, and you see it in the Balkans, and it's such a complex situation. And it's how even when he comes back at the end of the book, not only has he changed, but the Balkans has changed. The final enclave where he's at is no longer an enclave and has integrated into everything else. But early on in the book, the sort of hatred of the people there towards other people, and how some people no longer have a country because the place that they once called home is no longer on a quote-unquote official map. So you just have countryless people. And the sort of conflicts across Europe. But the idea that kind of underlines this part of the novel is this idea of a unified Europe, which is really interesting in a way because it's a novel that very much appreciates the individuality and uniqueness and history of each European country, but nonetheless believes in an idea of a grander Europe, which as an American is an interesting concept to me. You come from a place that's a very big country, and we only have two countries bordering us, Canada to the north and Mexico to the south. And then, I've lived in Japan, which is an island nation, which post Meiji has been pretty much unified and, is just Japan. So while it does have like China and Russia to the north, nonetheless, it is its own sort of isolated thing. It doesn't have that sort of direct border that a lot of European countries have. So for me, that aspect is interesting to the story. The sort of conflict, not really conflict, but question of identity between European and your own home country, and which supersedes the other. Can Europeaners all be united by this concept of Europe? Can that transcend the loyalty to their own countries or your own heritage? And I think that that's an interesting question. And if it's not necessarily one that the book interrogates super deeply, I think it's kind of the sort of wish at the heart of the book, at least with regards to that. But granted, that's my sort of extremely ignorant take on it. But because I think that you have these sort of visual metaphorical characters. In fact, arguably at the end, the whole thing has just been one giant metaphor, which explains, it's kind of all taken place in the writer's head, because, when he's telling the story, he talks about a dog that follows him along, and that though it's not the same dog, he runs into dogs at multiple places, which he then treats as the same dog. Or the woman that he's running away from, and then eventually there's a woman that he's running towards, and the question of these being the same woman. But it's also that there's not ever a woman. That's really a question. And while I don't really fully understand the book well enough to say exactly what the woman represents to the character, I think it's very easy to say that let's just take like the broadest interpretation and say it's happiness, because he talks about how he's never been able to be in a relationship because he always inevitably focuses so much on his writing. And so at the start of the book, he's sort of running away from this woman. And then in the middle of the book, he encounters what he thinks is this other woman, has a really passionate affair. And then they get into an argument and go their separate ways. Then later on, they're going to meet up again. And then he realizes that the women that he really liked and the woman that he's running away from are the same, and banishes her again before ultimately accepting his guilt later on in the night and bringing the woman who is waiting for him outside up into his bedroom, and finally not congregating, but sort of, let's just say merging, whatever, accepting her. And again, like him running away from the happiness at the same time as him, in order to finally obtain that happiness, he needs to let go of his guilt, needs to accept that the thing that he's running from is at the same time the very thing that he's running towards. And again, like I said, I mentioned the dog being a sort of constant metaphor for like a companion along the way. This sort of metaphoric, symbolic representation of things in the writer's journey and his sort of quest for happiness and his quest for identity. It's hard because I was so conflicted with so many other things to really nail down kind of precisely what these points mean, but it gives you an idea of like kind of what I mean when I say it's a very symbolic book. And again, the various people who listen to him on the boat, and the question of whether or not they're real, but again, the way in which each one represents some important stage on his journey, all the way up to the child who he calls the future writer, the sort of future generation, and the way in which he sort of becomes unrecognizable to people as he undergoes this journey and undergoes this metamorphosis of self-discovery. It's all very symbolic, and I don't believe meant to be taken very literally. Which brings us then to the part of the story that I think was the most interesting, which is the, I say the most interesting, but definitely the one that I feel that I kind of grasped the most, which was the comments about storytelling itself, vis-a-vis how we are being told he is telling the story, and how that is being contradicted either by himself or by other people, the other people in the room, who again are very likely to just be other facets of himself, calling into question the way that he's telling the story, which it can also be a way that you talk about not just the stories that we tell other people, but also our memories and the way that we sort of tell stories ourselves. So it's interesting. Um, like I said, whenever he's sort of called into question. So there's one part where he's at a uh, they call it a Jew harp, mouth harp, contest, world like contest, and he describes being so enraged by everybody coming together to do these sort of national anthems, but then they break off from the national anthem into their own sort of impromptu performance, and how everybody is sort of bastardizing the tradition of the harp in order to make this sort of new, like I said, jazz sort of freeform style. And he gets so enraged that he grabs his own harp and joins in a fit of fury, which is funny because then later on, in that same sort of anecdote, one of the other listeners on the boat speaks up and says that no such sort of impromptu national anthem freeform event happened, that it was all in fact a dream, and that when he woke up, he just kind of went mad at nothing and started performing a bit like a madman. And there is this sort of question throughout the story about what is more important, the sort of literal event that happened, or the sort of exaggeration, the sort of metaphysical meaning that it has to both the storyteller and to the people listening. There's these questions of time, these questions of what details are you sharing and what details are you omitting, and how important are those to the story. There's one character that's constantly interrupting to ask for more details, and sometimes you just want to smack him, and sometimes you kind of understand where he's coming from, and it makes you sort of appreciate as a reader that you are entirely at the mercy of the writer as a storyteller, and he is clearly not a reliable storyteller, not only in the fact that he presents things from his own perspective and his own versions of reality, but also because the way he talks about time is very questionable too. Time seems to expand and contract at will, and the sort of metaphorical events happen parallel to real events. So, for instance, at one point he's walking down a road to his hometown, and along the road he meets first a former politician who's now a painter. Then later on he meets a son who is sort of suffering for the sins of his father. And then as he walks down the road later on, he starts to see the former dead members of his family walking towards him and walking past him, before finally he encounters a character whom he calls Melchior, which, by the way, and another reason that this book is kind of so difficult to follow and get attached to is the complete absence of character names. Even in the rare event that a character is given a name, it is a pseudonym at best. So that's just another way in which it sort of challenges getting really connected to the characters. But going back to Melchior, who ultimately ends up being kind of a representative, symbolically again, of the criticisms against not just the novelist, but anybody who kind of believes in the value of the novel in the modern day world, and sort of really tears apart not just the writer, but also the idea of written fiction in a world which no longer seems to have much of a taste or much of an interest in it. And again, I don't really take Melchior as a character that exists in reality, but a character who represents something about the protagonist, a sort of manifestation of that kind of reception towards the character's work and what the character thinks the world thinks of his work. And I think it's interesting that this character, to the writer's perception, is somebody who's really amiable, really pleasant. A lot of people really like him, presents himself to be a really friendly, happy-go-lucky person, but then at the same time not only absolutely rips the writer, but is somebody completely themselves devoid and empty of ideals. And it's difficult for me, and this is where when you get into stories with this much symbolism, it gets really hard to kind of parse out what you feel versus what the author intended, particularly, again, when I don't feel like I have such a super strong understanding of the book. But I personally drew a lot of connection with like social media, in the sense that he talks very much about his success, his money, his wealth, his attractiveness to women, and how the writer's integrity and holding to sort of old truths, and the idea that something about humanity can be captured in the beauty of language and words and storytelling is outdated, and that it's all about journals and movies and things like that nowadays. It just, for me, again, it might not be what he had in mind, but for me was just very reminiscent of social media, and how it's sort of come to dominate the way in which we communicate. But I don't want to make it seem like it's just social media so much as the social media is the newest and far and away most effective manifestation of the sort of anti-intellectual corporate ideal, and the way that it sells itself is something that's so appealing, while at the same time being run by people who are so malicious towards really just like the greater human good, but really anything other than their own personal gain. And I'm starting to cough now, which is a good time to start wrapping this up, because ultimately it's a really interesting book because it's so full of symbolism, while at the same time not being surreal in the way that you would expect of something like a Kafka, of a Murakami, or of something of that ilk. Like I said, you've got these sort of metaphorical characters, but they're only half characters. They're more ideas, and it's this sort of, like I said, lack of psychology that made it really a struggle for me to get into. But nonetheless, the symbolism itself was very interesting to think about, and the writing was quite compelling. So I'm actually glad that I read this, and that it ended up being as good as it was, and as intriguing as it was. So join me next time when I talk about something way, way, way more mainstream, but nonetheless from another Nobel winner. So see you then.